Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome again back to our latest episode of our AmLaw podcast, where I've got our trusted business development director, Alexander Verbitsky. Alex, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, sir. How are you?
Good, good. Thanks for joining me again. And thanks for continuing our series that we've been doing here over the last few months about talking about all things related to business and transitioning to the US and different ways, configurations, visas, stuff like that, how that works out. For people who aren't familiar with us, or your first time joining our podcast, we at AmLaw Group for nearly 20 years have been helping entrepreneurs, investors, highly skilled professionals make a transition to the US. And as part of that, we have this regular podcast where we talk about different aspects and we kind of try to do a deep dive into different aspects of this problems that commonly come up. And Alex is a great source of questions and issues that a lot of our clients are seeing. And so we try to focus on, hone in on some of those issues that clients are, having questions about and provide some resolution and guidance, not only for that question, but help provide some guidance for them to, eventually move forward with some strategy. So today, Alex, I think we were going to talk about a situation that's come up oftentimes and maybe most recently where, anybody who's been watching this knows you and I are a big proponent of E-2 visas, but we know it's not the do all and end all. There can be cases where an E-2 is maybe not the best option and an L-1, for example, might be better. So I guess maybe you've got a fact situation, a scenario we can talk about, and then talk about where an L-1 might be better.
Yeah, for sure. So I had a really great conversation with a potential customer of ours, potential client, and he has a very interesting situation where he originally came to us with interest for the E-2 visa, right? He wanted to come to the United States. He has two adult sons that he thinks that would come and be essential employees into that business that he would start up. And he's in a particular business. I don't want to get into too much detail, but he's running a business in a foreign country right now. And it's fairly large, and he's planning an exit from that company, right? And he would open up a similar business in the United States. He also expressed that he'd be interested in, or he plans to selling his foreign company. He'd be interested in selling his foreign company, and that is in the works. Okay, so he painted this picture that I want to exit this foreign country, come to the UK and operate a business that is similar to the foreign business. Okay. And we got talking a little bit more, and his plans is to eventually potentially immigrate to the United States. So then the conversation stemmed from E-2 visa to L-1 visa. All right.
Mhm.
And he does have more than 8 employees. And if he were to open up a US entity, he would also have more than 8 employees. Right. So this provided him this idea that, hey, you know what? Instead of selling my interests later early, I could either sell it later on, or I could sell it now, but keep a certain amount of interest until I get my green card. I think you'll clarify on that, how can you sell your business in a foreign country, but still remain, I guess,
Eligible, maybe to.
eligible for the EB1C, right? So he was excited about it. He said, you know what? Another 2-3 years of working and expanding a business, flying back and forth between the foreign country and the U.S. company to essentially manage, the foreign business and also manage the U.S. business is still available to him under the L-1 visa, right? It's not until that he receives, let's say, an EB1C, does he have to sort of have a minimum stay requirement. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, right? I mean, once you go towards that green card path, you have to be in the United States in essentially a minimum of 180 days out of the calendar year so that you
Mhm.
become a tax resident. So, it's this situation. And then he also has his son, his 2 children, right? And those 2 children currently work for that foreign business, right? So it opens up the doors again for L-1 visas for those 2 children. All
Right.
right. So I painted this picture. It sounded good to him. What sort of advice would you provide to him right now if he was listening?
Well, yeah, that's a very interesting scenario, and we often kind of recommend people go with an E-2 over an L-1 just because it's easier, fewer employees to hire, fewer qualifying factors and stuff. But based on what you're saying, yeah, he might be an ideal candidate for an L-1. And why is that? Well, some of the reasons that you mentioned. So if he's ultimately looking at immigrating to the US, Not always, but yes, the L1 and then transitioning over to the EB1C is a more direct way of doing it. Because let's play this out a little bit. If he starts with the E2, like he was thinking about before he spoke with you, okay, you get the E2, easy to get, valid for 5 years. And then what, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think ultimately he kind of wants to retire, right? In the US. He's not planning on,
Correct.
working another 10, 20 years. So you think about that. If you've got an E2 and you want to convert over to a green card, the most common ways that people do that, and I'm not saying these are the only ways, but the most common ways is just because it's kind of easy, is either through employment, so you get an EB2, EB3, or maybe through EB5. So EB5, you got to invest 400,000, not necessarily in your own E2 business. You might invest it in, a development business, regional centers, stuff like that. But, it's a big chunk of cash. And does he have that cash that he wants to freeze up? The other option with the EB2, EB3 to get a green card doesn't sound like that's of appeal to him either, because he's at the end of his career. He doesn't want to work, another 5, 10 years. And here's the thing, as we all know, the EB2, EB3 just takes a long time to get. It's going to take 3 or 4 years by the time you get through that, line. And so he's likely going to be, on the beaches of Miami relaxing.
Yeah. And he's an entrepreneur at heart, right? The
He doesn't want to
idea
go
of
work
him
for somebody else.
Yeah, he's not going to want to work for someone. And just thinking about it, why would I work for someone else to get let's say, to
A
be on a
green
path
card,
for a
yeah.
green card when you could build a business and exit out of 2 businesses, right? Out of 2
Mhm.
companies, right? So that'll be a good idea as well for him.
Yeah, right. So yeah, this guy would probably be, sounds like kind of an ideal candidate. And kind of the exception where we might say, hey, hold it up here with the E2, that might not be the best option long term for you. And maybe do the L1. So don't sell the business right away in the UK, because right, as soon as he sells that business in the UK, he can't stay in L1 status, or he can't wait for his EB1C. Once he gets the green card through the EB1C, sure, then he can do whatever he wants. He can sell the business, do everything. So yeah, that sounds like a great opportunity that, if he would have to keep a controlling stake in, well, here's the nuance. I was going to say he's got to keep a controlling stake in his UK business as well as US, but even that's not true. Why? Because if let's say, he wants to gradually exit the UK business. And let's say he found a buyer for the UK business, but that buyer wants control, because otherwise he's not going to buy it. You could set it up where, let's say he sells 60% to the new buyer, he stays on with 40%. So he's got a minority share, and you might say, well, that's not going to work for an L1 or an E2. It would work for an L1 if, I don't know if you'd want to do this, but if you have the same ownership structure in the 2 companies. So if he sells that buyer of the UK company also 60% of the US company. And so that buyer has an equal, if you have the equal shareholders with roughly equal amounts that each shareholder holds in the 2
Mhm.
countries, that would work too. So the most common way is, yes, just having, our client owns the foreign company, majority control, and he owns the US company. But I don't know what this guy's plans are, but he could theoretically sell control of the UK company and still get the L1, provided you have the same structure of ownership.
Well, on a business perspective, right? You're going to be building a business in the United States that is adding value to a sale. It just doesn't really make sense to
Correct.
sort of
Right.
give the same equal stake. So if I can clarify, if he sells his interests in the UK business now, and let's say he has to remain 40% as a shareholder in the UK business, that it must match like a mirror to the US business. He can't have 100% shares of the US business and 40% of the UK business.
Correct. Correct.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
Yeah.
So it sounds more plausible that they would maintain ownership of the UK business, open the US business,
Mm.
expand that business, and make it part of a sale. Correct?
Right.
Right. So
Right.
100% in the UK business, 100% in the US business, and then develop that US business and then sell it as a package deal. Right.
Right. Right. Yep. Something like
Okay.
that. Yeah. Yep.
Okay. So at what point can he, let's say he does that, right? And let's say he stays on as a 40% shareholder, and it's, what's it called? It comes to term over 3 years that he has to remain on the, as part of the agreement, they have to remain as
An
part of the
employee?
team.
Yeah.
Yeah. During the transitional period, right? Because it's such
Uh-huh.
a niche business. So
Mhm.
let's say during that period, they do sell the business and both companies become 60-40 split at that point, right? So he's on the L1, he sells the company, and he sells 60% of the shares of both businesses. So now he's 40-40. Does that ruin sort of the initial application? Can he do it while he
Uh,
has the L1 visa, or no, right? So that
That's
that
that's
I
a that's a really good question, Alex. That's a good
yeah.
question. We've never had that scenario come up. So you're saying he owns 100% at the outset, he gets the L1, and then some point while he's got the L1, they change the ownership structure where, let's say before he had 100% of both, later he has 40% of both, and somebody else has 60%. That's a good question. I'd have to research that and look into that. I would
Okay.
say, let me just think though. I would say the retain I think it should work. I think it should work. I mean, we're getting into some nuances of corporate, law and structure, and USCIS officers aren't always the sharpest tools in the shed in terms of corporate law and stuff like that. But I think if it happened at the same time, see, the requirement is they have to maintain the same affiliated structure and ownership. So if we could time it such that, December 31st, it's 100, and then starting January 1st, it's 60/40, I think, it should be okay. And if you look at the corporate world in general, think about it, multinationals, they have mergers and acquisitions and they acquire companies and stuff like that. And, as long as you can show that affiliated relationship, okay, some of the shareholdings, change or something, but as long as you still maintain that kind of requirement. So something that I'll circle back to you on, but I think the
Okay.
short answer is it should work. It should work.
Okay. So here's another follow-up question. Okay. So another scenario of, when does the sale occur and when do the shares transfer essentially, right? So to me, the conversation that I had with him, it was very, very productive. It was very good and very, let's say it showed flexibility in let's say the idea and the sale of the business, right? So it could be put up as soon as, tomorrow, or he'd be willing to entertain the idea of selling it a year from now. So if he gets started on the process of, opening up that company in the United States and we get him the L1 visa, he within 12 months he hires a minimum of 8 employees, and now we submit the EB1C application for him. At, if he sells the business when he gets the EB1C, or when the EB1C application had been submitted, I don't know what your response will be, if there's a difference, the time of application or the issuance of the EB1C. But the main question is, at the point of him getting the EB1C, is he allowed to sell the business at that point, right?
Sure. Yeah, he's allowed to sell the business, but what we would say is he could sell the business not when he files for the EB1C and not even when he gets the approval, but when he gets the actual green card. So that's probably a little bit later than he might hope for because, right? So you can get the approval within 45 business days if you do premium processing. So you get the approval, let's say within 45 business days, theoretically he could sell it at that point. But recently, recent years, they're often still doing checks, even if after the approval, because there's going to be a period of time from when he gets the approval and he gets the actual green card. And if you're in the US, they periodically they call you in for interviews. I'd say it's the minority of people, but maybe 20% get called in. And at that point, they do kind of a due diligence. They double check, okay, who owns this company, who owns that company, all that other stuff. So you don't want to, you want to avoid that situation where you go in there and you say, well, I technically don't own the company anymore. Or they
Okay,
could even find you.
roughly.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, let's give a rough estimate. Let's say 12 months goes by, we file for EB1C. After the application has been filed, at what point do you get the green card?
I would say, so let's say 12 months goes by, you file it, 45 business days, that's about 2 months, calendar days. You get the approval. How quickly do you get the green card? If you're adjusting status in the US, I would say 6 to 8 months after that. And if you're going to the embassy and you're going to get the immigrant visa there, it might be a little bit more than 6 to 8 months, maybe closer to a year. So I would say
Okay.
basically from the time you file till you get the green card, yeah, roughly a year. So you're going to have to
Okay.
maintain ownership for roughly that year.
Okay. So let's say he has a 2-year timeline until he has to sell his company, or until he
Right,
could
right,
sell his company and not risk any sort of
right. Yeah, yeah.
USCIS repercussions. Okay. Yeah. Very good. Very
And then
good.
if he's got, and
I think,
you mentioned his sons too, if they wanted to
right.
file, they might be well qualified for L1s, maybe L1Bs or L1A, or they could even come technically on an E-2 visa theoretically, depending on the ownership structure and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And you could even have, again, this depend on a lot of factors, maybe he might get the EB1C. And then let's say he didn't sell the UK company or anything. He kept everything. He could turn over ownership or sell it to one of his kids. And then the other son could come over and then get an EB1C as well. They kind of do that too,
Mhm.
where they recycle. You have the same company. There's nothing prohibiting you from getting multiple EB1Cs. First, you get it for the first, CEO owner. Then let's say you sell management or you sell control to your son. then he could come over on the EB-1C as well.
Yeah, that's great because the sons are going to be getting L-1 visas regardless. So, I mean, we previously spoke on a previous episode that your time freezes under the L-1 visa, right? So let's say they never sell
Yeah.
the company, they maintain ownership, and they're in the United States for 3 years, and then that ownership changes, and then the sons can pursue the EB-1C. However, my understanding is that the EB-1C could be still pursued by the sons after a year regardless, correct? If you go from being an L-1B holder and then moving up to an EB-1C, that's possible, right? In some circumstances.
Yeah, it's possible. It's possible. But
Okay.
you made a good point though, that if the time frame gets stretched out, and let's say he doesn't get his green card for 3 years, and the sons are here for 3 years in the L1, you're right. That clock where you have to look back to see if he was working overseas in one of the past 3 years, the clock stops when they enter on the L1. So they could be here 3 years in that L1B or L1A, and they still qualify, for the
Correct,
employment.
correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, so for anyone that's listening, as Charles just mentioned, in order to qualify for the L-1 visa and then eventually the EB-1C, you have to work 12 months in the past 3 years for the foreign company. All right. There's let's say, instance where when you enter under the L-1 visa into the United States, the clock actually stops. So you could be in the United States working on the L-1 visa for 3-4 years, but they would still treat it and go back to
Yeah, they look at the
account
3
for the
years
12
just before
months
you entered the US, right?
just before you enter. Yeah. So
Yeah.
very interesting, very cool. Well, I think that provided a lot of information
Sure.
for not only this individual that I spoke with this morning, but also for any viewers out there that are in a similar situation.
Absolutely. So I think we've gotten into a lot of nitty-gritty here with the E2 and L1s, and I don't think there's a lot of information out there about this. So if this
Yeah.
is of relevance to you and your particular situation, stuff like that, feel free to reach out. Contacts below, either to sign up for an appointment with Alex or with myself, and just have an initial discussion with us and see how we can assist.
Yeah, for sure. So check out the description below. You could schedule those calls. And as always, like and subscribe.
Yeah, there you go. Yep. Always appreciate that.
But
Thank you,
thanks,
folks.
Charles.
We'll see you next time.